We built a property management company. We had a real estate brokerage firm too. They were working symbiotically, but we hadn't actually built a business based on values. We were reacting to the market demands in Portland, and we kept saying yes and yes and yes and yes. And all of a sudden we had 200 homes under management and nearly 20 real estate agents working with us. And I mean, for me, it kind of came on quickly, like, this is not feeling good. And we're not actually able to create impact out of this because the fundamental structures of our business were not based on a value system.
Right.
And you and I really went inwards in the fall of 2019 and began what I think is a massive culture shift within our own family and our own selves of tapping into intuition. And I remember it was January of 2020 when the Regenerative Real Estate podcast was launched formally.
Welcome to the Regenerative Real Estate Podcast, a show about human environments and how they can be used as a force for good. Conversations that educate and inspire people looking for a different way to do real estate. I'm Neal Collins, and on the show today, I have a very special guest joining me for the first time. She is no stranger to the show, however, and she has shaped it in more ways than you can possibly imagine. Her name is Alissa Collins, and she's not only my wife and life partner, but also the co-founder of Latitude. She is a gardener, an eco-spiritualist, and a passionate regenerative practitioner. This show has been a long time coming, but I've got to be honest. It's one thing to invite guests onto the show and interview them about their life and work. It is something completely different to do that with your wife partner who you know so intimately. Alissa has been encouraging me to do a show about my own journey into regenerative real estate. And I got to be honest, the thought of rambling into a microphone by myself is pretty intimidating. What better way, though, to have Alissa join me for a conversation that covers our journey over the last 2 decades that has taken us across the globe to now calling in a new way to think about real estate as the catalyst to create life-giving homes and habitats. This is an intimate show about the emergence of Latitude, regenerative real estate, and ultimately 2 people that are simply looking to do good work in the world. Okay, we're going to jump into this. So this is going to be a really fun conversation. I've got my partner, Alissa, here, who we don't really get to hear too often from. Alissa, why don't you say hi real quick?
Hey, everybody. Alissa here.
Okay, so this is going to be a fun episode because we get to really flip the script. We are, 2 years into this podcast, and Alissa is very much involved with everything regenerative real estate and what we are doing at Latitude, but she has never graced us with the presence on this podcast. And she made a really interesting point that I don't ever really get to share my background on this podcast either, that so much emphasis is on the guest. So I'm really excited. I feel like this is a rich role, Julie experience. So let me start it off. And just so that we can stay on track here, why don't we start, Alissa, with where you grew up? And let's start the genesis story of like, what is our regenerative story? But it really starts us off as us as individuals.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I was born and raised in Anchorage, Alaska, the land of the Dena'ina people. And being born and raised in Alaska, I feel, was a pretty special experience because the proximity to wildness into beauty, into nature was just right out the door. I'm blessed to have had a mother and have a father who's still alive. My mother passed away in January of 2021, but they really seeded a love of nature from an early age. And that took a form of cross-country skiing in Kincaid Park and lots of bike rides along the Tony Knowles Coastal Trail and playtime in the Chugach Mountains.
I remember we met at graduate school in Vermont.
Mm-hmm.
And I remember sitting at a table and you came up and I could just see you from across the room, just like this radiant person walking towards me. And you said hello and you said, "Where are you from?" And I said, "Louisiana." And I could see across your face being like, "Louisiana, Louisiana, Louisiana." Yeah, I don't know anything about that. And you just were like, "Okay, well, see you later."
Yeah, totally. It's interesting how the places we grow up have a really strong culture. And I felt like Alaska was the center of my universe. Alaskans, maybe like Texans, maybe like Louisianians, it feels like that is the only place worth paying attention to. Everything's bigger. Everything's better. Our mountains are more grandiose. Our rivers are more beautiful. And to some degree, we still have a lot more wild creatures and wildlife to enjoy up there. So that was a really interesting story and narrative that played into my upbringing. So I know I've apologized from being like so blasé, like Louisiana, like who lives in Louisiana? So
well, this is where I want to pick up the story, is that you and I come from north and south. It's these polarities. And you come from a place of almost untouched natural beauty. And I grew up in Louisiana where it was like my childhood was pockmarked with climate crisis.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, from an early memory of Hurricane Andrew, a Category 5 hurricane decimating South Louisiana, to obviously some of the larger examples, which was Hurricane Katrina, which happened whenever I was in college. I then ended up leaving Louisiana because I wanted to go see the world. And I ended up going to the Peace Corps, working with rural agricultural producers in Eastern Europe in a country called Moldova. And that's where I just sat in horror at watching the Deepwater Horizon oil spill that lasted for 88 consecutive days.
Can I say something about the Deepwater Horizon oil spill? That's what connected me to Louisiana and what galvanized me in my first moment of activism. Environmentalism and love of nature had always been a strong core value of mine, but showing up for basically the waters of our earth and the beaches. I coordinated the first Hands Across the Sand event. And I think that was in like 2007. And it helped me connect Alaska to Louisiana. And then not many years later did I meet you and get a chance to really learn about what's happened there. I feel that part of my story and my awakening is experiencing the grief of the earth, and Louisiana being this place that could have been and still is in many ways so beautiful and rich in those swamps. And I had a chance to go experience those with you. And I know you were talking about the Peace Corps and your experience in Moldova, but it was the Deepwater Horizon that like shook me to my core. And it brought back memories of 1989, the Valdez oil spill, when I was 5. And remembering those stories and how many people were mobilized in Alaska and from around the world to go serve and be a part of those cleanup efforts. And so Deepwater Horizon really galvanized me to like take action. And I think 70 people showed up at that Hands Across the Sand event, and we just held hands.
So we met in Vermont in graduate school. And I think really where at that time I was doing a lot of seeking. I was looking for adventure. Mm-hmm. I was looking to start my career. I was studying sustainable development, and you were in a graduate program. Let's see if I can get this right. Intercultural Service, Leadership, and Management. Mm-hmm. That's a mouthful. But along those lines of sustainable development. And what's funny is that I grew up really with this worldview that you can either go work for money and then do good somewhere else, and that's how I was getting framed of like doing good in the world. But they're quite mutually exclusive. And so it was, okay, wait, how do I fit in? Because we were told I think you're on the upper side of the millennial generation. I'm a little bit younger than you, so squarely a millennial. We were told that we could do anything that we wanted in the world.
Yeah, follow your passion.
Follow our passion. And for me, growing up during these really interesting times where it was really that galvanizing moment of like climate change is real. And for me, it was, how do I work in the world while all this is going on and make an impact? And I think that's what I deepened into in Peace Corps. And then the really fun thing was, out of graduate school, we got to go on an assignment into India and then Maldives. But why don't you share about what we did in India first?
We had the opportunity to go work on a heritage project in Ahmedabad, India, which is close to where Gandhi was from. And the dean of our school at the time, Preeti Shroff Mehta, she invited us as a team to go there and really document a changing part of India. The built environment was changing.
The culture
was changing. And there was an element of technology, right? We're building an app where people could go geotag their favorite tree and tell a story about that tree.
Or not just a tree, but like significant heritage markers or significant places in people's lives.
Yeah, well, it was a time of crowdsourcing. Like, hey, oh my gosh, wouldn't it be amazing if we could get the people of Ahmedabad to like upload and share their favorite places? At least that's what I remember.
Yeah, it's funny that that story is one of the through lines of our careers, but also really in India particularly, it's a nation of 800 different kingdoms, if not more. And it's just this cultural melting pot, strife with tension, and us trying to really figure out, how do you navigate this as a visitor and someone that's not just visiting, but also working within that context. And also realizing that they're going through these cultural changes of English is now getting taught as either a first language or a second language. And so a lot of that rich individual cultural context of these different kingdoms and tribes are getting blanched out, as well as what we know around the environment of, we're in this northwestern state of Gujarat, where it was the last of the Asiatic lion territory.
Yeah. Preeti took us to a national park where the last of the Asiatic lions were. The last. And that was what it felt like India was. It was seeing dying arts, animals on the brink, and people and their cultural identity. Not just on the brink, but have like the homogenized culture that all of a sudden everyone was living in. And Ahmedabad being such an interesting place to have landed, because we lived there for about a year. And then, though, what I love about this is actually where real estate kind of begins to show up in our lives.
Yeah. I mean, the Haveli, which for people that don't know what the Haveli is, you can think of it as like ancient architecture around an Indian mansion that has elements of rainwater capture into, is it a limestone cavern that disinfects the water.
Naturally antimicrobial.
Right. It's got passive solar and cooling, where think of tree-lined streets. So cool air could come in from the lower level, and then it could circulate up through the middle and heat to escape. And it's multi-generational and with incredible craftsmanship. And so you're right. Like, that is a place where real estate first really entered into our consciousness. And the thing that I'll just like in the India chapter for me is I started to realize that people can see the world so differently, and to really feel on a deeper level what worldviews are. Because if you look down the street in India, as a Westerner, I would perceive something totally different than what an Indian would, because there are so many religious subtones and contexts that culture started to ingrain itself into why do we do what we do.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, well, puja is going on. There's just a mystery and a mysticism and a spirituality that deeply touched my soul in India when I look back on my neighborhood in Anchorage as having, like, there was nothing to gather around. We weren't walking down the street and gathering at the temple or the chabutra, which is where, they were working, feeding the birds, or lighting a candle in honor of spirit. And it really activated something within me. The one thing I also want to say, though, going back a little bit to the real estate pieces, I guess our boss, Abai Mangaldas, he was buying these old Havelis. I'm not sure how many, but he had bought a couple of them and had rehabilitated them and brought life back to them. And he had a purpose and a mission, though, behind his real estate endeavors and practices, which was to preserve the artist's way. And the commercial activity that was happening inside the house of MG was to educate and inspire the visitors of what the ancient artists' ways were. And so you could buy textiles, pictures, a lot of copper wares that were made by hand by somebody. And so it was in direct juxtaposition to the Amazon culture that was coming to India. And so I felt like it was the first purpose-driven real estate professional that we got to know. And I didn't make that connection, though, till many, many years later.
Yeah, India is one of those places that for me, it took a while to really process and put all the pieces together. Yeah. Because while that work was finding those artisans and helping to bring a market to them, we were still really steeped in this paradigm of Western aid coming to help, and seeing the UN Sustainable Development Goals as
the ultimate,
as like poverty alleviation, and how many people are living on less than $2 a day that are in the ultra poor category. And it's taken a lot of years to realize that, like, that economic standardization on that metric of you're poor because you don't make this amount of money, and now thrusting people into a market economy and really devaluing the cultural heritage and all the practices that came before. We are living in that time. Yeah. And I really thought my career was going to be in international development and aid, and why I had chosen to go to the Peace Corps and things like that. But why don't we go into the next chapter, which we stayed in South Asia, but it was further south in the island nation of the Maldives.
Well, first of all, you needed to write a thesis. Like, this was a part of our graduate program. All of this life in India and then to Maldives, we had to go do a year of practice in the real world. So a year on campus, a year off campus in the world. And so I want to ask you a question of, like, what led you to the Maldives? Because I got to be a beneficiary as you invited me into that journey.
Yeah, I mean, that's such a rich question for me. After I had this experience in Eastern Europe with the Peace Corps, it was in a country that was the breadbasket of the USSR. And there was a lot of wine that was produced in Moldova. And I don't want to denigrate Moldova. Like, I have such fond memories of it, but I also remember quite distinctly alcoholism being a huge problem. So much so that it was really challenging for me to go to work at an agricultural extension office, because my job was liaising with a lot of farmers, drinking a lot of alcohol, a lot of homemade wine and grain spirits, and just whatever it was. It was like a 2.5 year period where I was probably sober, much less to a significant degree than that I was under the influence. And I really wanted to get away. And so I ended up in Indonesia and spending time in the islands and really feeling this, like, deep connection with the ocean and with diving and snorkeling, and, like, really getting to experience a rekindling of a love affair that I had growing up in Louisiana, being so like on the water, in the marshes, in the Gulf of Mexico every weekend with my dad, fishing and getting to enjoy that ecosystem. And so I ended up finding a program called the Maldives Whale Shark Research Program in the Maldives, that they were doing citizen science and a monitoring program around whale sharks, where the Maldives is one of the most significant places where whale sharks can be found year round. They're a pelagic species, so they like travel the globe. But the Maldives, what's so special about it is that it provides habitat for a nursery for juvenile, mainly male whale sharks. And I instantly gravitated towards this program because what they were trying to do is use the whale shark as the keystone species to create a marine protected area, because the whale sharks were getting struck by boats. They were getting crowded from the tourist pressures. And the premise is really, let's use the whale shark. Let's protect that. Let's protect the reefs underneath it, and really bring kind of a community development aspect towards the benefits of a marine protected area. And so I was able to go there pre-India for a little bit, and then they invited us both back. And as you can imagine, like for anybody that's gone to the Maldives, what's so wild is that you fly into this beautiful, colorful city in the middle of the ocean, and you have these atolls. So think of like volcanoes coming up out of the ocean, but the tops are lobbed off, so you could just see like beautiful white sand beaches with palm trees and coconut trees studding these islands. And we get to live on one in the South Ari Atoll. And that was just such a deepening again of the ocean. And that's where I really got to understand climate is driven mainly from what's going on in the ocean, and that like the ocean is our largest carbon sink. And what is going on in the ocean, we don't really get to talk about very much, because it's so far away for so many of us. Like we hear reports about ocean acidification and bleaching, but we don't really understand what that means. And that's what was so fun about being in the Maldives for those couple of years, is like being in the ocean and witnessing just the beauty as well as the changing of the climate on a very real basis.
Yeah. When you have an opportunity to swim in the ocean nearly every day for 2 years and get really good at free diving, rather than using scuba tanks to be with these animals, you just all of a sudden become a mermaid and merman and merhuman. I mean, that's what we got to do. And I think having that level of connection to nature is one of the greatest gifts that I have ever received, because I know what is going on in the ocean. It's out of sight, out of mind for so many people, but we know what it's like. We have direct experience when we see the hawksbill turtle coming up in a net, and we have the chance to jump in and free it of that net. Or we've seen the tremendous damage to a whale shark that has been chopped up its back. Or its fin has been lobbed off because of a speedboat racing up and down the reef.
Or even international pressures around finning of sharks for shark fin soup and things like that.
Yeah. So, I mean, to be that intimately connected to the more than human world is, I think, what it's seeded for us, like how we are in the world today.
Yeah. Well, I think the interesting thing for me is the choice to leave the Maldives. Like we both had graduate school degrees. We were getting paid a stipend, but not a salary. Mm-hmm. We were both really far from home. And again, it comes back to that cultural context of, in the Maldives, there's resort islands and then there are local islands. And we got to see both sides of that world living on a local island. But because of the cultural differences, where women were in burqa, it was largely separated men and women. It never really felt like we were able to integrate into the local community there. Yeah. Now we get to make friends and really understand how life got to work from an outside perspective, but I wouldn't say like we created a life there over 2 years.
Yeah. And that, I think, is a really important part of the consciousness shift too, out of like the white savior mentality. of when we were studying sustainable development in the mid 2000s. I mean, maybe we were criticizing what structural adjustment programs looked like in the 90s. But for us, the opportunity to go and experience it, but then the Maldivians took over the project, and for us to essentially leave and go on our way and go find our place and our role in the world is exactly what we needed to do, because the Maldivians have their right to also solve their problems in their unique, authentic way too.
Yeah. And that, I remember coming back to the United States and trying to figure out, like, what are we going to do? And people had this conception that, why would you come back? Like, there's so many problems out there. And I think it's become abundantly apparent by coming home to the United States. Like, the wheels are falling off the car in our backyard. Like, the United States is probably one of the top places where good work is really needed.
Yeah.
But trying to figure out what that was it's a journey. And I think that's why we're here today.
Of course, because bless my parents. I feel like a big story that I've been unlearning in my life is that the grass is greener somewhere else. But really the grass is green where you water it. And so coming home to the United States, and then in our story, right, we picked Portland, Oregon. I had connections to Oregon from my college days at the University of Oregon. And you seemed to be ready for an adventure. Like, you didn't want to go back and raise a family in the South. So we decided, like, okay, let's go Pacific Northwest. It was literally geographic center between Anchorage and Baton Rouge at the time where our families were. And it was like a hip poppin' city, Portland. Like, let's go, and hang out with some friends and see where this life is going to take us.
Yeah. And I think this is the beginning of what could be like a great decision or a really divide, and what could have been a divide in our relationship at the time. But you and I drove across the country after getting married in my parents' backyard, and I was listening to podcasts. And this is like whenever podcasts first came out. And it's so cool that we're actually recording the conversation on a podcast now. That I stumbled upon a podcast about real estate investing. Mm-hmm. And it almost clicked, because for the past however many years, we were trying to go out and raise money to go do some kind of a project. And you're like beholden to some rich donor that is going to benevolently give you money, and you hopefully have some kind of social impact return that you're promising as part of that project. But real estate investing particularly was like, you go raise money, you secure that money against a piece of property that is acting as collateral, and then you do something with it and you improve it and you give the money back, either by selling the property or by refinancing it and being able to hold on to it. And at the time, I thought, maybe this is a way that we could make money so that then we could go do something like a passion project and go back to the Maldives or something like that without having to worry about money. It wasn't really into my consciousness at the time of like, how do we do regenerative real estate? No. Or how do we upgrade these properties to be more resilient or community oriented, or whatever the theme would be. It was mainly around like, how do we go find, and I'm intentionally using this word, the rhetoric right now of like, how do we find underperforming assets that have been neglected and increase the value through rehabbing it. Mm-hmm. And I was more interested in, how do we buy and hold real estate to create cash flow? Yeah. And what was your response? This is the best part.
Oh, well, it would be bleeped out, but it was, Neal's like, we're driving somewhere across the Great Plains. He's like, we're going to go into real estate when we get to Portland. And I just emphatically, I was shocked. I was like, oh my God, that sounds terrible. Like, what have we been doing for the last couple of years, or a lifetime's worth of work as children into teenagers into 20s? Like, real estate seems so antithetical to the stories and the narratives that we've been inculcated into, and I felt extreme fear and distrust of the industry. But then the conversation subsided. We rolled into Portland, and that still stuck with you though. I was applying for jobs like at Mercy Corps and other nonprofits and organizations that were, doing great things in the world. And you were going to go like do the real estate thing.
Yeah. And this is where I think a lot of people, they want to get into the real estate industry and they realize it's pretty hard to do that. Like it's capital intensive, but more than that, it's perseverance.
Oh my gosh.
I guess we're lucky in some traditional sense that like we're in a quickly changing city, that a lot of net in-migration was happening. People wanted to move to Portland, probably because the show Portlandia had really popularized that. It was considered one of the cheaper big cities on the West Coast. And there's a great food scene there. And so we started to buy small apartment buildings that we were able to really work with people, work with landlords that had a tax problem. They had owned these buildings for a long time. They typically weren't very involved, so the places were pretty run down. We bought a couple places that was just, it was pretty tragic to see kind of the state that.
And like, when is this? What years?
This is like 2015, 2016, 2017 was really those prime years of acquiring real estate, learning how to manage contractors, work with budgets, structure off-market deals, utilize seller financing as our capital strategy, borrow money from private lenders, and then renovate properties and re-tenant. And that's where I think you really do start to confront like how do you work in that realm of development and real estate investment without displacing people. And that's a real thing. And that is a gray area that I think a lot of people do not like to sit in that.
Like most of the real estate investors in America today don't want to sit there.
Right.
Like most of them, probably 98%.
Yeah. And this is where
which is my statistic.
And I think the thing for me that really stands out is that if you look at the patterns of what's going on and try to understand, like, why are all of a sudden people living on the street? Like it doesn't just happen. It's not just vets with a PTSD with a drinking problem. It is also the actions of how we treat our places and our homes and our multifamily apartments. Because if you are flipping a multifamily apartment and increasing the price by 50% or 60% or 100%, whatever it is, then now those people have to go somewhere else. And it really puts a downward pressure on the entire industry. And because the industry is chasing yield, that more and more, it's not just like Class A apartment buildings that are in like downtown LA that are getting scooped up and repositioned. Right. It is, we get to witness the mobile home parks and the trailers, the trailer parks that are getting acquired by institutional investors that they're saying, oh, we can buy this, increase the rent from $500 a month to $650 a month. That's a pretty big squeeze in terms of a percentage increase. But not only do you have that downward pressure from Class A to Class B to Class C, but whenever you're looking at the mobile home parks, like you're working with people that are on pensions, Social Security, and whenever their rent goes up that much, there's nowhere else to go but the car. And so for me, it became really apparent, like our actions, no matter what we do in the real estate industry, have reverberations that we might not abundantly see. It is a wealth generating asset or industry. Yes, unequivocally, on this old story that I think really is no longer serving us. And
it hasn't served.
Well, it served
some people.
Such a small amount of people, and they typically look like me.
You and I.
Like, right, they are white, healthy, educated individuals. that, it's how long can you really put your blinders on working within that industry? The interesting part for me is looking at how we grew professionally, which was not just acquiring real estate and then managing it, but thinking, okay, if I'm supposed to be doing this entrepreneurial path of working on the business, not in the business, then we started to hire a property manager and an assistant and a leasing agent. And so what ended up happening was like, well, all the revenue was going to pay other people's salaries. So we needed to increase revenue. This is just like my linear thinking. And so we started to manage other people's properties. So we created a property management company. And then those people, our clients, were starting to want to buy and sell and trade their properties and asked us to help them. And that turned into a brokerage activity. And so in a very short amount of time, it really scaled quickly into, we have agents that are working with us. We have a property management company with a couple hundred homes in Portland that we're managing, kind of single family, smaller, multifamily, up to probably like 16 units. And then getting to a point where there's a couple of different things that happened to us in our life that really made us rethink what we're doing around not only the impact that we're having in the industry, but really recognizing that our values are not showing up here. Like if we wanted to work in sustainable development, what did that really mean?
Well, we were pretty much out of alignment, and it was becoming untenable because we built a property management company. We had a real estate brokerage firm too. They were working symbiotically, but none of our values were present. We hadn't actually built a business based on values. We were reacting to the market demands in Portland and people's demands. And we kept saying yes and yes and yes and yes. And all of a sudden we had 200 homes under management and nearly 20 real estate agents working with us. And I mean, for me, it kind of came on quickly. Like, this is not feeling good. And we're not actually able to create impact out of this because the fundamental structures of our business were not based on a value system.
Right.
And when I say value system, I mean, we had values of like great customer service and responsiveness and things of like kind of, I don't want to call them platitudes of the business world, but we were kind of operating on just that in the standard way. And it was really in 2019 that we recognized that everything needed to be composted. And we did. We began that process of getting out of property management and telling nearly 200 clients it was time to go find another property management home. Same with the brokers. And you and I really went inwards in the fall of 2019 and began what I think is a massive culture shift that within our own family and our own selves of tapping into intuition and an inner knowingness that seemed to be coming forward. Like, we can't do this anymore and we need to rethink it. And I remember it was January of 2020 when the Regenerative Real Estate podcast was launched formally, but it was the fall where that was gestating. And we were saying things because we were going to leave the industry.
Before we get back into this episode, I want to take a second to express my gratitude for you, the listener. Producing this show has been a real labor of love for me, and it has connected me with people and organizations doing amazing things from across the globe. We've had people invest in projects as a result of this show, new teams have been formed, and careers have been changed. And the fun part for me is that we're nowhere close to realizing the potential of this show. In order to do that, we are looking to partner with value-aligned brands and companies that hold a vision for a resilient, regenerative, and beautiful world. For the first time ever, we are opening up spots For brands to advertise on this show and through our other platforms that we have at Latitude Regenerative Real Estate, like our journal and our webinars, this is a great way to get your company message out to an incredible group of visionaries, culture creators, and people from across the globe. We're going to be running special rates for spring and summer months as we gear up for the second annual Regenerative Real Estate Gathering happening at the end of August. To find out more, you can visit our media offering on Latitude's website at chooselatitude.com or send us an email at team@chooselatitude.com. Well, we have to bring up that a lot of our elders ended up getting sick.
Oh, yeah.
Like health was a big thing for us. That like our parents came down with cancer diagnoses. Other elders in our life had cancer, were getting ALS. And it was a real big wake-up call to say, like, why on earth are these 60-year-old people that are healthy all of a sudden coming down with terminal diagnoses? And at the time, realizing that health is wealth. Mm-hmm. It's not just the reoccurring passive income that the real estate industry was really promoting, which was around, and why I think so many people get into real estate that really captivated me originally was like financial freedom. Mm-hmm. Like the financial freedom is the wealth building activity, and like so much of it is geared towards like create legacy for your children and their children. And like the only underlying metric of success was what your net worth is. Mm-hmm. And then to have so many of our elders go through these medical challenges really was like, holy smokes, this is insane. And realizing that it's our own industry, the industry that we've been working in, that it's the health of our soil is impacting the health of ourselves and our microbiome, really putting a lot of credence on what Dr. Zach Bush was talking about of, here's a doctor that was saying, I'm trying to treat the cancer and I'm looking at the microbiome within people, and this is directly related to what they're eating and the health of the soil and the microbiome in the soil that's getting destroyed through chemical agriculture. And also seeing that, it's the water that we're drinking, the air we're breathing, the food we're eating, the materials that we're building out of, and realizing that like we are designing and constructing and managing in a way that is not life-giving. It is extirpating life and destroying the environment. And the very nature of how we work within the economy is extractive and destructive and marginalizing.
Well, yeah. So those are like the big realizations that we were going through, right? Because we had to start looking at the built environment. I think that when my mom got diagnosed with breast cancer first, and then it was melanoma second, there was also another narrative of that these things are genetic and that somehow it's on us humans, like our genetic lineage is what is going to undermine us. And then actually, I think it's such a seed of distrust in our own bodies and our own body's wisdom. Like that's what I've had to think about, because my body, am I a part of this genetic lineage of, and I could, right? The BRCA gene, these things, I can go on that journey. But when I started looking at the history of land management in my family and what had happened in the farming communities of the Midwest, which is where my mom came from, and the chemical agriculture that began, I couldn't help but start to make linkages to the chemicals, both in our lands and on our soil, and then the chemicals that are in our homes.
Right.
And shining a light on that. And I found that at the time when I was helping represent clients, that actually I had a fair number of clients in Portland ask really good questions about health and wellness related topics of home or the ecological elements of the yards. And it was my clients' questions that ultimately started paving the way and shining light that, like, oh yeah, I can actually give better counsel during every transaction here. And it ties in the climate change work because it's climate change adaptation at home. It's building resilience at home, but it's actually beginning to look at home as a place of wholeness and self as a part of wholeness rather than parts. And that, I think, is what laid the groundwork for you and I to begin saying, well, we can do this differently. And out of like the trauma of cancer diagnoses in elders, out of the trauma of a chemical agriculture industry that is causing so much havoc in our systems, coupled with good questions from my clients, ultimately led to, hey, like, what if we could do this regeneratively?
Yeah. And well, that's where I think my experience within Peace Corps, working with agricultural producers and really studying permaculture for the first time and realizing like there's different ways that's predicated upon stewardship, and really starting to see that those principles that are engendered within permaculture, that even predates Bill Mollison and David Holmgren coming up with the term permaculture, but really land stewardship that's been practiced for as long as humans have been on the planet, and creating that reciprocity around how do we steward our habitats so that they are abundant. Like that need is so present now than it ever has been, because our baseline has shifted so far down. And so for me, it wasn't how do we go practice sustainable real estate? It was what's different? Like, what are we really trying to rally around? Yeah. And, we talked about health and wellness, and health being wealth and well-being being so central to what we're doing. And it really came together with other real estate professionals that we were really chewing on the same thing around like, okay, regenerative real estate. How might we design? How might we construct? How might we transact? And how might we steward home and habitat differently? And so we came up collectively with a framework that I think we use to this day, which is around the 5 roots of regeneration, of regenerative real estate. That is health and wellness, sustainability, and sustainability having a really wide encompassing term of like, is this the rainwater capture? Is it the solar panels and the electric vehicles closed loop systems, the materials that we're using, all amazing things, but not the whole that you're talking about. And then let's get into ecology. Ecology also being like the life that we're surrounding ourselves with, and the soil, and if we're talking urban environments around like backyard habitat and the pollinators, and if we're talking more rural landscapes, how do we do regenerative agriculture? So really trying to orient towards
ecological thinking
and just like the life, capital L in life. And then it brings us into community. And I think that's one that we can really, on a couple of different levels, get into, which was first around like, how do we design and orient ourselves into an atmosphere where it's not just the isolated nuclear family that puts so much pressure on mom and dad to make things work, and everybody has to have their own set of tools in their own cars, and
even as simple as knowing your neighbor, knowing one's neighbors, and them knowing you, right? And how do we work well together? These were questions that we were holding, though. And community, that is how humans have survived for the times that we've been on this planet, is in community with our people.
Right. I mean,
like it's like innate to being human.
It is innate.
And like how we've been separated from community into the nuclear family was incredibly disturbing to us. And we were seeing that, and we have been experiencing the pressure of that. So community is a massive root in the regenerative real estate framework.
But for me, what I've really deepened into over the years has been around what does a whole community look like, and how can we really expose the marginalizing and oppressive side of real estate, and really look at what does equity and access and inclusion look like. Because I've always shied away from affordable housing. If I'm being honest, like if you were to survey me in like 2019 to say, what are the issues that you really care about, I would have gone straight towards the environmental side and be like, we are in an environmental crisis. Oh, and if you want to talk to me about affordable housing and gentrification and all that, like that's almost too big. Like I don't know how to get into that. We're having to marry public-private partnerships together, and I'm trying to like do something completely different because I was really scared of it, and I think now I am much more versed and passionate about what does equity look like within community? What does affordability look like? Because now we are really talking about the sovereignty of people, the cultural preservation, cultural, just
heritage,
cultural
celebration.
Right.
Recognizing that diversity is inherent to a thriving ecosystem, and how might that look for us as people?
Right. And just realizing like structurally what works well for a small percentage of the people not just doesn't work for a lot of other people, but it is actively oppressing them. Mm-hmm. And that's a narrative that I continuously I'm trying to orient towards in my career to say, you know what, like, let's not skip over this because it's hard and it brings up a lot of emotion. We have to embrace this and say, we really need to rethink some things.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Well, thanks for sharing that.
Yeah. And so the last route, and not to skip over this one, but first it was really saying like, what is the spiritual essence of home? And we're like chewing on that as a community within Latitude to say like, is it spirituality? Is that what we're doing? Or is that word going to really be turning people off? And so we settled on spirit.
I'm the one that I feel like really, as you and I talked about it, was it going to be the 4 roots or the 5 roots, and spirit being the 5th? And that is this innate human condition as well, as being spiritually connected to our places and to the more than human world and to the cosmos. And it can be what makes us feel safe and grounded. We have our practices. Our practices create memories. And those memories of home and place and times is what makes it for a rich life. And so I felt really strongly that we needed to name spirit, because it's what would enable someone to also care for their place. Like what we did see in India and what we did see in the Maldives. Or I remember when we saw up in northern India in Leh, in Ladakh, a village that had people caring for flowers, like just effervescent barrels of flowers and boxes of flowers. And these were, quote unquote, poor people, according to what the UN. But it was a moment I'm like, but look at how many flowers they have. Like, if you can care for flowers and create beauty in the world and surround yourself in beauty, then are you poor?
Yeah. And spirit really coming out to me, how do we find meaning in all of this? It's meaning
making, and memory making, and being with people, which gets back into the community root. So I know we've been talking about the roots in this framework. And what I really love about the framework is it's an empowering framework for people to bring into their lives, because I remember when I made a huge connection that I can't wait for another philanthropist or a foundation or a billionaire to make another contraption to take the plastic out of the ocean. Or I remember exercising my agency and becoming accountable to myself, my home, my neighborhood, and my community. And that agency and accountability is incredibly empowering. And so the roots of regenerative real estate for me is an active agency. I can do this at home. And my vision and my dream is that every single human being on the planet acts in this way to restore and heal land and self through a regenerative framework. Because this is, everybody can do this. And our homes and the built environment as it stands today, we know that things need to evolve. And the tools are available.
Well, this is where I started to make the connection that home is habitat.
Yeah.
And it's so rich with metaphor. And, for those people that are tuned into the podcast, you realize like we're jamming together the built environment as well as the natural environment as well as agriculture. It's kind of like we're really chewing on how do you talk about a human sculpted world. And that's what we do live in is like we are now in an era where we choose which lands are wild, quote unquote wild, and which are deemed urban. But under that spirit root, and this is why I think we both have really gravitated towards like biodynamic farming and agriculture and our son is in a Waldorf school. It's because it sees us as part of a greater sense of the cosmos and the universe, and that it's not with humans at the center of it. We are just a part. And how do we orient?
Yeah.
Especially whenever we're going through times of extreme trauma and needing to find the healing.
Yeah. Well, and the times of extreme trauma and how many centuries they've been going on for now. I've been really interested in when did the disconnect really begin? And so a lot of my readings have taken me back to, the transition out of the occult way of being into the fragmented way of being under the Cartesian paradigms. And Morris Berman in his book, The Reenchantment of the Earth, like really highlighted to me when capitalism and science and religion just married and created the condition to create parts. The trees became timber that you could sell. The metals that we extract out of the earth became bullets or cannons to go shoot at somebody else. And it's helped, though, give me an understanding of the past to make sense of today, to dream into what can be. And that's what we're living. And so one of the things that I wanted to bring in for us to talk about is, do you remember the day that we were in Portland? And actually, I think we were talking to Adam Scrency on the phone. And we were realizing that regenerative real estate isn't a product, but it's a process.
I do remember that because so many people wanted to know, like, what, and to this day, they want to know, like, show me the regenerative home.
Yeah.
And we really were struggling with that because it's like, well, is it the living building? Is it a living building challenge property where I will give them a lot of credit. Like the Living Building Challenge is arguably the most rigorous green building certification out there that's based upon a regenerative design. So
equity,
how do you
beauty,
equity, beauty, energy, water, like how can a property generate more than it is taking? And this rallying cry around, sustainability is about doing less bad and regeneration is about doing good. But if you think about that, and you don't have to think too long about this, what is good and what is bad? It's so subjective. And so it really codified in my mind around, we're not trying to do good. We're trying to orient towards life-giving environments rather than life-taking.
Yeah. Also, what is being in right relationship with self and place? Like what feels good to you might be different for me. And I think my hope and goal is that for those who are in the regenerative movement and practicing, right? This is what this is. It's a practice. It's a daily practice. So when you go and lay your head down on the pillow at night, you feel good and satiated with the work that you did that day.
Yeah. And last year at the Regenerative Real Estate Gathering in Saco, Maine at Riverbend Farm, what was one of the very memorable things about that conference for me is that Aaron Fairchild, a co-CEO of Green Canopy Node, who's been on the podcast a couple of times now, and a real mentor for us, had talked about what is regenerative enough. And that has really made me just sink into that it is regenerative thinking. It is the quality of our thinking. It is like if you want to be so perfect that like you're going to be the armchair regenerator to say like, oh, well, you're driving a fossil fuel car, or you're doing this, or you're doing that. And like pinpointing everything. Like I had a designer tell me the other day, she's like, well, you're using paint. Like paint's not regenerative. And I'm like, we're really splitting hairs. Like we are living in a gray world. And as Aaron calls it, and I don't want to take credit for it, this arc of hypocrisy that we're all finding ourselves on, that ultimately what we have done in the past, what worked in the 20th century for some people is no longer going to serve us in the 21st century. That even if you were living in your single family house that was built in 1950, like we still have a long way to go to upgrade our infrastructure and heal our places, our habitats, our cities, our towns, our agricultural lands, like just so much.
Yeah. So it's a process, and wherever someone is at is where we want to be able to meet them, because there's a journey. We're all on the journey together, and no one has to feel like they have to minimize themselves and their existence, which is a part of the sustainability paradigm. Like, oh, I'm going to do less bad, or I'm going to reduce my footprint, and I'm not going to do this. I'm not going to do that. But then like, what are you going to do? How can you take up space and be in your truth and your authenticity and tap into your intuition? And I think intuition is such an important piece of our story, because like, had we not listened, maybe we would have jobs and we'd be doing something else. Because of that fall of 2019, we had a big choice in front of us. Are we going to do this or not?
The interesting thing for me now is that we created Latitude. It started off as your kind of like ubiquitous boutique brokerage and property management firm out of a city. We then composted so many different elements of that, only to really try to seed this idea of what is regenerative real estate. And the podcast was the big thrust of that, with the business model for Latitude being, we're working for other people as sales agents. And it was really trying to still reconcile the investing and the developing that we had done in our past, and using sales as this interesting way in which you get to work with people at such like big moments in their life history of they're ending one chapter and they're dreaming into the next chapter. And it is involving real property, and it's involving hundreds of thousands of dollars. And you're really looking at like, how can you help somebody make this transition and really bring in like what lights them up? Like if you don't have the ability to go out and put solar panels on and put a heat pump in and go with the induction stove and insulate and then create a edible landscape and get your electric vehicle and capture rainwater, like all of the things that you could possibly do, it's how do you work with people on that process? But one of the things that I'm really realizing more than ever is that like, if you look at the people that have come onto this podcast, we're not talking about just sales as the way to introduce regeneration. It is people that are doing regenerative agriculture. It's people that are creating cooperatives and community land trust. It's people that are really pushing forward this concept of wellness within the built environment. We've had just such a plurality of people that are all exploring what it really means to have a regenerative culture. We just happen to really ground it with, well, what does that look like for professionals that are working from design to planning to construction to finance to development, and saying, yeah, how do we work together? How do we create interdependence and create solutions that were never thought of or possible before?
Yeah, the ecosystem approach that we're taking is bringing the businesses, the best of the business minds today in the regenerative space to hold these kinds of questions. And from the real estate transaction to life beyond, like we have to be able to consider the whole life cycle of a person at home. And obviously, like how a city changes and evolves with urban planning is a part of this, but going back to that agency piece and giving people permission to own their place on this planet and like be in their power and have creative expression and playfulness during this time is something that I've really landed upon, because it's been so heavy and it's been so grief stricken, and there's been so many miles run on trails crying and trying to understand my place or your place and like what's happening, that I've now landed in a place of joy. And what Robin Wall Kimmerer says, the earth gives me joy daily and I must return the gift. And braiding sweetgrass, for instance, became a pivotal moment in my life of really settling into what is joy and what is that for me, and how could I create the conditions for my family to experience that. And we have agency, and that's what everyone needs to know. We have agency because we can't wait. We just can't wait anymore. And it starts at home with your 2 feet on the ground.
And your wallet and your decisions and everything that comes with how we get through our day.
Yeah, and asking for help and seeking help and being in community, and however someone wants to start though, right? Whether it is their wallet or like declaring it to somebody or asking for help. There is myriad ways to enter the journey and the process, because our lives have changed significantly since we do this. We live in a new place. We're surrounded by new mentors and elders. We've moved, and now we live on 5 acres, and have our own tiny home village that's popping up around us, learning about how water is going to flow, reconnecting the nutrient cycle, and composting our human waste. What would human composting look like?
Human composting is a hot topic.
A natural burial at our home. I mean, that legitimately is coming up for us, right? Like how we're practicing it. And that's just it. It's a practice. And it's taken multiple years of conversations within our families to create the conditions for the culture change to emerge. What was once a nuclear family is now coming together as a multi-generational family. And that has taken an immense amount of time, but it's good. It's good work.
What is lighting you up right now around the direction that regenerative real estate is going in, or maybe the direction that we're going with Latitude?
Well, what's lighting me up? There's so many things that are lighting me up. So when it comes to Latitude, it's really sinking into storytelling, right? The new story. This is coming up constantly, and our opportunity for us to tell more stories and create more compelling, beautiful, rich videos that accompany the work. And so that way people can see images, and it doesn't have to be the dystopian narrative that has been so consistent out of Hollywood. But what does that look like? The new story. I'm really excited about that. I'm also really excited about the ecosystem and aligning with and continuing to work with the leaders and what we can do together so that business to business relationship building, because I see the businesses in the regenerative space as the future. That just is it. And if we can help the humans of America and beyond, like align their spending habits and their values with these businesses, then then the new world we want will emerge, because the business world can move nimbly and quickly. And that's what's so exciting about this, is actually when we come together in community, we can do really amazing things. And last but not least, the third thing I'm really excited about is our office here in Langley and Fernie, which is our project to activate a building that needed love And it's a place about books and plants and purpose. And this is a way for the passerby to come in and be surrounded in biophilia and learn about it, and aliveness of plants and titles that are curated from my decade of reading now that I feel are accessible, digestible, fun, engaging, action-oriented, in addition to amplifying BIPOC voices and harnessing the wisdom from them. So Fernie is the name of our shop here in the office. And I can't even tell you how enriching it is for people to come in and be literally floored that a place like this exists. It's so hopeful. So to bring that into 4D for people is one of the greatest gifts that I can be experiencing in my professional life.
Yeah, I mean, it is such a beautiful resonant space. And it's fun to be able to curate that experience for people, especially with titles from people that have been on the show and the thought leaders that we've really gotten a lot of inspiration from. And now I think what you talked about, the ecosystem, this is a business ecosystem, and it's not just for-profit business, it's also nonprofits of really coming together to create something, that new world that you're talking about, and really having now the opportunity to open up community, that it's no longer just the Latitude community of realtors, but what does it look like to have developers and architects and designers and financiers and
permaculturalists,
farmers, everybody really coming together that are working around home and habitat to create that regenerative story. And so I'm really excited for those of you that are listening, like, we have a mighty network that just come in and introduce yourself and what brought you into the regenerative real estate community. And if you want to seep yourself into that on a weekly basis, you can do that. We have just such a breadth of experience that's really lighting me up, and then really seeing where my career is heading, which is not around the transaction anymore. It is really focused on what does it look like to combine affordable housing with regenerative agriculture. And what are the things that need to happen to bring those two together? Because as you'll hear, like, we brought on some people recently that are experts in agri-HUDs, experts in cooperatives and in community land trust, and seeing that, yes, we need to conserve our agricultural lands. We also are deficient in housing units. But if we're just going to go out and build at market rate, then we're going to be building really expensive new development homes. And it's really cool to go, like, look at some of these communities that are out there that are, like, they're unattainable for most people, or for a lot of people. But what are the ways in which we can create that diversity of not just multi-generational living, but how do we create homes that are affordable for multi-income, and not just the benevolent landlords that we're hiring a farmer, but how do we integrate farming as not the amenity, but the basis of the community. So I'm really excited around what that work looks like. And it's bringing in all these different facets, from pocket neighborhoods and being in mentorship with Ross Chapin, who brought us to this island, to other people like Ian McSweeney and what he's doing with the Agrarian Trust, that I'm just so blown away by. And Farmer D doing agri-HUDs and really saying, like, I've done all this great work, but we have so much more to go. So what does this look like? And now really just getting excited around, what does development look like for the 21st century that's going to be prime and resilient, going into an era that we are all saying is going to,
that's happening.
That's happening around. It's not just like, climate change is in the future, but like
in the impending doom,
the impending climate change, it is like we are living through that right now.
We're in it.
Well, Alissa, this has been a lot of fun. Hopefully it will be one of many more to come, because there's a lot of area in there that we can explore. But thank you for just the opportunity to have a new kind of podcast. And I've had a couple new formats of podcasts, but this is certainly a special one for me.
Yeah. Well, it's a pleasure to be on the journey with you, Neal, and with everybody else who's a supporter of the show and a listener. We just can't thank you enough for showing up, giving good reviews and ratings, sharing your comments and thoughts. It helps us keep going too when we get to hear from you all. So don't hesitate to reach out by any means. Anyway, that's it. We're going to sign off. Got to go get our son from school.
Ending these things are always so hard. I know. You never know what to say.
Yeah. Like speaking to the microphone.
Yeah. No, you did fantastic. Thank you.
All right. Bye, everybody.
If you want to follow our work at Latitude, you can follow us on Instagram at latitude.regenerative.re, and mine is at I am Neal Collins. We inherently believe in the potential that comes from connecting value-aligned and purpose-driven people together in community. That's why I encourage you to join our mighty network and introduce yourself to the other people working across the globe to advance a more regenerative, resilient, and beautiful world. Here, we want to know what you're working on and what inspires you. Through this platform, you can attend live events, take courses provided by our podcast guests, and create connection with other people and businesses that share your same passion. To join, find the link in our show notes or visit our website at chooselatitude.com. If you'd like to support the show, please share it with your friends and be sure to follow us on your podcast app so that you always have the latest episode downloaded. Another way to support our regenerative field building is to leave us a rating and review on Apple Podcasts. Positive ratings help attract amazing guests, and they can be the deciding factor for someone else to tune in and listen. And who knows, maybe this is the kind of motivation that it takes for them to finally decide to align their profession with their sustainable and regenerative values and become a positive force for good within their own community. This show was produced by myself and edited by Anthony Wallace and offered as a part of our work with Latitude Regenerative Real Estate.